Not today, nobody dies alone out here. Margaret Whitmore's weathered hands trembled as she pressed them against the frozen neck of the unconscious biker, searching desperately for a pulse. The Hells Angels skull patch on his leather jacket stared back at her like a warning. Behind her, the second rider lay motionless in the snow, blood freezing across his temple. The entire town would call her insane. The police would question her judgment. Her neighbors would fear for her safety. But as the blizzard howled through Black Ridge Road that morning, the 79-year-old widow made a choice that would change everything. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and stay with me until the end of this incredible true story. Comment below with your city so I can see how far this message has traveled. Now let me tell you what really happened that frozen morning in Pine Hollow. The thermometer outside Margaret Whitmore's kitchen window read -18 degrees Fahrenheit when she laced up her hiking boots that Tuesday morning. She'd walked Black Ridge Road every dawn for the past 6 years, ever since Daniel died, and she wasn't about to stop because of cold weather. Her late husband used to joke that she was tougher than the Montana mountains themselves. "You're stubborn as a mule, Maggie," he'd say, kissing her forehead before his early shifts at the lumber mill. "That's why I married you." Margaret smiled at the memory as she zipped her heavy parka. The cabin felt emptier every year, but the routine kept her grounded. 5 miles up the mountain road, 5 miles back down. Every morning, no exceptions. She stepped outside into air so cold it burned her lungs. The snow had fallen and heavy overnight, blanketing the evergreens in white silence. Margaret's breath formed thick clouds as she started up the familiar path, her boots crunching through fresh powder. The sky was still dark stars fading as dawn approached, somewhere beyond the mountain peaks. She'd walked maybe 2 miles when she noticed the tracks. Not deer, not elk, tire marks, motorcycle tire marks. They swerved violently across the road, cutting deep gouges through the snow before disappearing over the edge near the guardrail. Margaret's military training kicked in immediately. Something was wrong. She quickened her pace, following the tracks, her heart beginning to pound. That's when she saw the wreckage. 2 Harley-Davidson motorcycles lay twisted and mangled against the trees, their chrome handlebars bent at impossible angles. Shattered glass sparkled across the snow like deadly diamonds. And there, slumped against the guardrail, were 2 men in black leather jackets. Neither one was moving. Margaret ran. Her boots slipped on ice as she dropped to her knees beside the first rider. He was massive, easily 6'3", 250 pounds of muscle and tattoos. His face was gray, lips turning blue. The patches on his jacket made her stomach tighten. Hells Angels. Montana chapter. The skull and wings everyone in the state recognized and feared. She ripped off her glove and pressed 2 fingers against his neck. Faint, very faint, but there was a pulse. "Hold on," she whispered. "Just hold on." The second biker was younger, maybe mid-20s, sprawled face down in the snow 10 feet away. Blood had frozen in a dark pool beneath his head. Margaret crawled to him, ignoring the sharp pain in her arthritic knees, and carefully turned him over. His eyes fluttered open for just a second. "Help," he breathed, so quiet she almost missed it. "Please." Then he was gone again, unconscious. Margaret's mind raced. She was alone on a mountain road in sub-zero temperatures with 2 critically injured men. No cell phone signal up here, never had been. The nearest house was her cabin, a 1.5 miles back down the mountain. The nearest hospital was Pine Hollow General, 40 minutes away in good weather. In this snow, it would take emergency services at least 2 hours to reach this location. These men would be dead in 20 minutes. She looked at the Hells Angels patches again. Every news report she'd ever seen flashed through her memory. Violence, drug trafficking, murder. The FBI had called them a criminal organization. Just last year, 3 Hells Angels members had been arrested in Billings for a bar shooting that left 2 people dead. Everyone in Montana knew to stay away from them. Margaret reached into her backpack and pulled out the old military medical kit she'd carried since her Army days. Her hands moved automatically, checking airways, assessing injuries, applying pressure to wounds. 40 years of nursing experience overrode everything else. The older biker had severe hypothermia, impossible internal bleeding. The younger one had a head wound that wouldn't stop seeping blood even frozen. Both needed immediate medical attention, or they'd die right here in the snow. She stood up, her breath coming hard, and looked back down the mountain toward her cabin. Then she did something that made absolutely no sense. She started dragging them. The older biker first. Margaret grabbed him under the arms and pulled with every ounce of strength, her 79-year-old body could summon. He barely moved. She tried again, grunting with effort, her boots sliding on ice. "Come on, Maggie," she muttered to herself, using Daniel's old nickname. "You've hauled wounded soldiers through worse than this." But that was 40 years ago, and she'd been young and strong. She pulled again. This time he shifted a few inches. It took her nearly 20 minutes to drag the big biker 50 feet to a flatter section of road. Her shoulders screamed in pain. Sweat froze on her forehead despite the cold. When she finally let him down, her arms were shaking so badly she could barely control them. The younger biker was lighter, but not by much. She dragged him next to his companion, then stood there gasping, trying to figure out her next move. That's when she remembered Daniel's sled. He'd built it 15 years ago from old lumber, and steel runners said every mountain cabin needed a good sled for emergencies. It was stored in the small shed near the trailhead about 100 yards back. Margaret ran. The shed door was frozen shut. She kicked it twice before it gave way, and there was the sled exactly where Daniel had left it, gathering dust, but still solid. She grabbed the rope handle and pulled it back to where the bikers lay dying. Getting them onto the sled was the hardest thing she'd done in years. The older biker was dead weight. Margaret rolled him, pushed him, used a broken tree branch as a lever, and finally, after what felt like forever, got him positioned on the wooden slats. The younger one she managed to lift just enough to slide him on top, their bodies tangled together like broken dolls. She tied them down with the old rope, making sure they wouldn't slide off, then grabbed the handle and started pulling. The sled moved maybe 2 feet before getting stuck in deep snow. "No," Margaret said out loud. "No, no, no, move!" She pulled harder. The sled lurched forward another foot, then stopped again. Behind her, the older biker made a sound, a low rattling wheeze that meant his airway was closing. Margaret's army training snapped into focus. She dropped the rope, moved to his head, tilted it back to open the airway, and listened. Breathing. Shallow, but breathing. She packed snow around both men to prevent further heat loss. Counterintuitive, but it would actually insulate them, then return to the rope. This time when she pulled, she didn't stop. Her boots dug into the snow. Her back bent nearly double. The rope cut into her shoulders, even through her thick coat. She pulled and pulled and pulled, one step at a time, down Black Ridge Road toward her cabin. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Her legs were screaming. Her lungs burned. Twice she slipped and fell, the rope nearly yanking her shoulders from their sockets. But she got back up every time. "Not today," she kept whispering between gasps. "Nobody dies alone out here. Not today." The sky was getting lighter now, dawn breaking pink and gold across the mountain peaks. Beautiful. Deadly. The temperature was still dropping. Margaret pulled. She was maybe halfway to the cabin when she heard the motorcycle. The sound echoed through the valley, a deep, powerful roar that sent ice through her veins. She stopped, turning to look back up the road. In the growing light, she could see a single headlight cutting through the snow, moving fast toward them. Another Hell's Angel. Margaret's first instinct was to hide. Get off the road. Stay out of sight. But she couldn't leave the two dying men. The motorcycle came closer, its engine growing louder. Margaret could see the rider now, big, wearing the same leather jacket, the same patches. He slowed as he approached the wrecked bikes, stopped, killed his engine. The silence that followed was terrifying. The rider dismounted and walked toward the wreckage, his boots crunching in the snow. He was examining the scene, looking at the blood, the broken metal, following the drag marks that led directly to where Margaret stood frozen beside her sled. He turned and saw her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the biker started walking toward her, his hand moving inside his jacket. Margaret didn't run. She stepped in front of the sled, placing herself between this stranger and the two men she'd been trying to save. "They're alive," she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "Barely. They need a hospital." The biker kept coming. He was younger than the others, maybe 30, with a thick beard and dark eyes that gave away nothing. When he was 20 feet away, he pulled his hand from his jacket. Margaret tensed. But instead of a weapon, he was holding a cell phone, looking at the screen. "No signal," he said. His voice was rough like gravel. "Never is up here." He put the phone away and looked past her at the sled, at his unconscious brothers tangled together in the rope. "Tank and rider," he said quietly. "Jesus Christ." Margaret kept her ground. "I'm taking them to my cabin. It's not far. You can help me pull, or you can get out of my way, but I'm not stopping." The biker's eyes snapped back to her face. He studied her for a moment, this tiny old woman with silver blonde hair and the kind of steel in her eyes that told him she meant every word. Then, without speaking, he moved past her and grabbed the rope. Together they pulled. The sled moved faster with two people hauling. The biker was strong, taking most of the weight, but Margaret refused to let go of her end. They moved in silence down the mountain road, the only sounds their breathing and the scrape of the sled's runners across packed snow. When they reached the cabin, the biker stopped and looked at the small log structure with obvious surprise. "You live here alone?" he asked. "I do now," Margaret said. She led the way to the porch. The biker, he said his name was Ghost, helped her carry Tank and Ryder inside one at a time. They laid them on the floor in front of the stone fireplace, where Margaret had already started a fire before her morning walk. The warmth hit them immediately. Margaret was already moving, stripping off the wet leather jackets, cutting away frozen clothing with scissors from her medical kit. Ghost stood back, watching her work with something like awe. "You know what you're doing," he said. It wasn't a question. "Army field nurse," Margaret replied without looking up. 40 years ago, but you don't forget." She pressed her stethoscope against Tank's chest, listening. His lung sounds are diminished on the left side, possible pneumothorax. And this one, she moved to Ryder, needs stitches in his scalp, maybe a CT scan for brain injury. Ghost pulled out his phone again. Still no signal. "I need to get down the mountain," he said. "Call for help." "Then go," Margaret said. "I'll keep them stable." But Ghost hesitated. "You don't understand. When the rest of the club finds out about this, when they learn you helped Tank and Ryder—" "What?" Margaret looked up at him. "They'll thank me." Ghost's expression was unreadable. "Maybe. Or maybe they'll think you're a witness to something. Maybe they'll wonder what Tank and Ryder told you before you found them. Maybe they'll decide you're a problem." Margaret went back to checking Ryder's pupils. "I've lived 79 years by doing what's right, not what's safe. Your friends needed help. I helped them, that's all. Lady, you don't know what you're dealing with. And you don't know who you're talking to." Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp. "Now either make yourself useful or get out of my cabin." Ghost stared at her for another moment, then did something unexpected. He smiled. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. He moved to the fireplace and started adding logs, building up the heat. Margaret worked on Tank, inserting an IV line from her medical supplies, expired but sterile, and starting a saline drip. The big biker's color was slowly improving, his breathing getting stronger. Ryder was worse. The head wound kept bleeding despite pressure. Margaret cleaned it carefully, applying butterfly bandages to close the gash, then wrapping his head in clean gauze. His eyes moved under the closed lids. REM sleep, not coma. Good sign. Ghost watched everything with quiet intensity. "How'd you learn all this?" he asked. "Vietnam," Margaret said simply. "Field hospital near Da Nang. We patched up boys younger than you and sent them back to die." Her hands never stopped moving as she spoke. "Swore when I came home I'd never let anyone die if I could prevent it. Don't care who they are. Don't care what they've done. Even if they're Hell's Angels." Margaret looked at him directly. "Even if they're the devil himself, a life is a life." Ghost was quiet for a moment. Then Tank's got a daughter, 8 years old. He hasn't seen her in 2 years because her mother won't let him near her. Says he's too dangerous. Margaret's hands paused just for a second. "It is he." "Yeah," Ghost admitted. "He is, or he was. Afghanistan messed him up pretty bad. He came back different, angry all the time. Started drinking, got into fights. The club was the only place that understood him." He looked down at Tank's unconscious form. "But he talks about his little girl every single day, carries her picture in his wallet." "And the younger one?" Margaret asked, nodding toward Ryder. "Foster kid, bounced around the system his whole life. Nobody wanted him because he had a temper, got in trouble. Aged out at 18 and the club took him in. Only family he's ever known." Ghost's voice dropped. "He's an artist, you know. Really good. Draws these incredible portraits. But nobody ever sees them. He keeps them hidden." Margaret absorbed this information while she worked. These weren't just faceless criminals. They were broken men with stories, with pain, with pieces of themselves they'd locked away to survive, just like the soldiers she treated in Vietnam. "They're going to live," she said finally, "but they need a hospital. Real doctors." Ghost nodded. "I'll head down now, but I should warn you when I tell the club what happened. They're going to come up here, all of them, and they're not going to ask permission first. Margaret met his eyes. Let them come. This is my home. I'll face whoever needs facing. You're either the bravest person I've ever met, Ghost said, or the craziest. Can it be both? Despite everything, Ghost laughed. It was a short, surprised sound like he'd forgotten how. He headed for the door, then stopped with his hand on the knob. Why'd you do it? He asked. Really, you could have kept walking. Could have called it in anonymously from town. Why risk everything for two guys you don't even know? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. My husband, Daniel, she said finally, was the kindest man I ever knew. Gentle, always helping people. One night, 40 years ago, he was driving home from work and saw a car broken down on the side of the road. Stopped to help. The driver pulled a gun and shot him in the chest. Her voice didn't waver. Left him bleeding in the dirt while they stole his wallet and his truck. Ghost's face went pale. Jesus, I'm sorry. I found him an hour later, Margaret continued. Still alive, barely. I got him to the hospital and he survived. 20 more years we had together before cancer took him. She looked up at Ghost. You want to know why I stopped for Tank and Ryder? Because somewhere 40 years ago, I was lying in the dark praying anyone would help the man I loved. And someone did. A stranger stopped, called for help, saved Daniel's life. She turned back to her patients. I won't be the person who drives past. Not ever. I won't be the one who decides someone isn't worth saving. Ghost stood frozen in the doorway. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked out into the snow. His motorcycle roared to life moments later, the sound fading as he disappeared down the mountain. Margaret was alone with Tank and Ryder. She sat down heavily in Daniel's old rocking chair, the one he'd carved himself from pine wood, and watched the two unconscious bikers breathing by her fireplace. The cabin was warm now, the fire crackling softly. Outside, the sun was finally rising, painting the snow gold through the windows. Her entire body ached. Her shoulders felt like they'd been torn apart. Her knees throbbed. But Tank's chest was rising and falling steadily. Ryder's bleeding had stopped. They were going to make it. Margaret closed her eyes for just a moment, letting the exhaustion wash over her. That's when Tank started screaming. His eyes flew open and he thrashed violently, arms flailing, mouth open in a wordless cry of terror. The IV line ripped out of his arm, blood spattering across the wooden floor. He was fighting invisible enemies trapped in some nightmare battlefield. Oh no, get down, get down. Margaret was on her feet instantly, despite the pain. She grabbed Tank's shoulders, or tried to. He was too strong. He threw her off easily, still screaming, still fighting. Tank, she shouted. You're safe. You're in Montana. You're home. But he couldn't hear her. His eyes were wild, seeing things that weren't there. He grabbed for a weapon that didn't exist, scrambled backward until he hit the wall, then curled into a ball with his hands over his head. Incoming. Incoming. Margaret approached slowly, hands raised, voice calm, despite her racing heart. Tank, listen to my voice. There's no incoming, no mortars. You're in a cabin in Pine Hollow, Montana. You're safe. She kept talking, kept moving closer until she could kneel beside him. Then she did something her training had taught her in Vietnam. She started singing. Softly. An old hymn her mother used to sing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Tank's breathing started to slow. That saved a wretch like me. His hands came down from his head. His eyes, still wild, found her face. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Recognition flickered. The nightmare was releasing him. Was blind, but now I see. Tank blinked. Once. Twice. His voice came out broken. Where am I? My cabin, Margaret said gently. You crashed your motorcycle. You're hurt, but you're alive. He looked around, taking in the room the fire rider still unconscious nearby. Then his eyes came back to Margaret, this tiny old woman with silver blonde hair kneeling beside him, like she'd done this 1,000 times. You pulled us out, he said. It wasn't a question. Somehow he knew. I did. Why? Margaret smiled. Because nobody dies alone on my mountain. Tank's eyes filled with tears. This massive tattooed biker who'd probably killed men with his bare hands started crying like a child, and he couldn't stop. Margaret put her hand on his shoulder and let him. Outside, the sun climbed higher, And down in Pine Hollow, Ghost was making the phone call that would change everything. The phone in Sheriff Bradley Coleman's office rang at 6:47 that morning, right as he was pouring his second cup of coffee. He almost didn't answer it. 23 years wearing the badge in Pine Hollow had taught him that early morning calls were never good news. Sheriff Coleman. Bradley, it's Karen Whitmore, Margaret's daughter-in-law. Her voice was shaking. Have you seen my mother-in-law this morning? Bradley frowned. Margaret, no, why would I? Because Ghost Hendricks just walked into the diner and told everyone she's got 2 Hell's Angels in her cabin. Karen was crying now. He said she dragged them off the mountain. Bradley, please tell me this is some kind of sick joke. The coffee cup slipped from Bradley's hand and shattered on the floor. Within 20 minutes, every phone in Pine Hollow was ringing. Margaret heard the vehicles coming long before she saw them. The rumble of engines echoed up through the valley, growing louder. She stood on her porch, one hand resting on the railing Daniel had built, and watched the headlights snake up Black Ridge Road through the early morning light. Behind her inside the cabin, Tank was sitting up now, his back against the stone fireplace. Ryder was still unconscious but stable. The IV was back in Tank's arm, held in place with medical tape that had yellowed with age but still worked. They're coming, Tank said quietly from inside. His voice was hoarse from screaming. You should go. Get out of here before... I'm not going anywhere, Margaret called back. This is my home. The first vehicle to crest the hill wasn't a motorcycle. It was Sheriff Coleman's patrol car light bar, flashing red and blue through the snow. He pulled to a stop 30 feet from the cabin and stepped out slowly, one hand resting on his sidearm. Margaret, he called out, I need you to come down from that porch right now. Good morning, Bradley, Margaret said calmly. Coffee's on, if you want some. This isn't funny. The sheriff moved closer, his boots crunching in the snow. I've got reports you're harboring fugitives. Hell's Angels members. Is that true? I've got 2 injured men who needed medical attention. That's true. Margaret, for God's sake. Bradley's face was red despite the cold. Do you have any idea what you've done, what these people are capable of? These people have names, Margaret said. Tank and Ryder, and right now they're injured and vulnerable, and under my protection. Your protection? Bradley looked at her like she'd lost her mind. You're 79 years old. 79 and still capable of making my own decisions. More vehicles were arriving now. Margaret recognized half the town, Karen and her husband, Tom the Hendersons from the general store, Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church, Jenny Chen, who ran the Chinese restaurant, old Frank Morrison, who taught history at the high school for 40 years. They parked in a semicircle around the cabin, engines idling, nobody getting out. They were afraid. Margaret could see it in their faces through the windshields. The same fear she'd seen on young soldiers' faces in Vietnam when the shelling started. Fear was a living thing, contagious, and it was spreading through her community like wildfire. Then she heard the motorcycles. The sound rolled up the mountain like thunder. Dozens of them, maybe more. The rumble shook the trees and sent snow cascading from the pine branches. Margaret's neighbors heard it too. Car doors locked with audible clicks. Someone screamed. Bradley's hand moved to his gun. Margaret, get in my car, now. No, that's an order. You don't give me orders, Bradley Coleman. I changed your diapers when you were a baby. Despite everything, Bradley's face flushed. Margaret, please. The motorcycles crested the hill. There must have been 30 of them, maybe 40. All Harleys, all black leather and chrome, all bearing the same skull and wings patch that had terrified communities across Montana for decades. They rolled up slowly, deliberately, engines growling like predators. The sound was deafening. Even as they slowed to a stop, the lead rider killed his engine. Silence fell across the mountain. He dismounted and removed his helmet, revealing a face that had been on wanted posters in 6 states. Victor Iron Jack Malone, president of the Montana Hell's Angels. 6'4", 280 pounds of muscle and scars. He'd done 2 stretches in federal prison for assault and weapons charges. The FBI had a file on him 3 inches thick. He walked toward Margaret's cabin like he owned the mountain. Bradley stepped between them, hand on his gun. That's far enough, Malone. Iron Jack didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Margaret standing alone on her porch in her faded blue parka and hiking boots. You the one who pulled my boys off the mountain. His voice was deep, rough as gravel. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. I am. Tank and Ryder. They alive. They are. Iron Jack studied her for a long moment. Behind him, the other Hells Angels had dismounted and were spreading out surrounding the cabin. Sheriff Coleman's hand tightened on his weapon, but he was smart enough to know he was outnumbered 20-1. I want to see them, Iron Jack said. No, Bradley said firmly. Nobody's going in that cabin except... They're inside, Margaret interrupted, speaking directly to Iron Jack. Tank's conscious. Ryder's still out, but stable. They both need a hospital, but I've done what I can. Karen pushed her way through the crowd of onlookers, her face white with terror. Mom, what are you doing? Get away from them. Margaret ignored her. She walked down the porch steps, slowly, her arthritic knees protesting every movement, until she was standing 5 feet from Iron Jack Malone, the most dangerous man in Montana. Up close, she could see the scar tissue around his eyes, the tattoos crawling up his neck, the cold calculation in his expression. She held out a cup of coffee she'd brought from inside. It's cold out here, she said. You want this or not, every person watching held their breath. Iron Jack looked at the coffee cup like it might be poisoned. Then his eyes came back to Margaret's face, this tiny old woman with silver blonde hair who was either the bravest or the most foolish person he'd ever encountered. He took the cup. Ma'am, he said quietly, nobody's talked to us like human beings in a very long time. He drank the coffee in 3 long swallows, then handed the cup back. Can I see my brothers? Margaret nodded. Follow me, but just you. The rest wait here. Bradley grabbed her arm. Margaret, no. I can't let you. She pulled free gently. Bradley, either trust me or arrest me. But make up your mind, because these men aren't going anywhere. She turned and walked back toward her cabin. Iron Jack followed. Behind them, the crowd erupted in panicked whispers. Karen was openly crying now. Tom had his arm around her shoulders, trying to comfort her while looking terrified himself. Pastor Williams was praying under his breath. Inside the cabin, Tank looked up as the door opened. When he saw Iron Jack, something flashed across his face, relief, fear, shame all mixed together. Jack, he said hoarsely. Jesus, I'm sorry. We were riding too fast, hit black ice. Shut up, Barna, Jack said, but there was no anger in it. He crossed the room and dropped to one knee beside Tank, examining him with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of injuries. How bad? Hypothermia, possible internal bleeding, some broken ribs. Tank gestured to Margaret. She pulled us out, both of us, dragged us down the mountain on a sled. Iron Jack turned to look at Margaret, who was standing by the fireplace adding logs. By yourself. Ghost helped at the end, Margaret said. But yes, mostly by myself. Why, it was the same question Tank had asked, the same question everyone would ask. Margaret was getting tired of answering it, but she understood why they needed to know. Because they needed help, she said simply. Iron Jack stood up. He was so big he had to duck slightly to avoid the low beams in the cabin ceiling. He looked at Ryder, still unconscious, then back at Margaret. You know who we are, he asked. I know what people say you are. And you helped us anyway. Margaret met his eyes. I was an army nurse in Vietnam. I've patched up Viet Cong soldiers who were trying to kill us an hour before they landed on my operating table. You think a motorcycle club scares me? For the first time in maybe 20 years, Iron Jack Malone smiled. It was brief, almost invisible, but it was there. No, ma'am, he said. I don't suppose we do. He walked back to the door, opened it, and called out to the other bikers waiting in the snow. Tank and Ryder are stable. We're taking them to the hospital. Then he turned back to Margaret. We'll need to carry them to the bikes. You got blankets. Over the next hour, Margaret's cabin became something nobody in Pine Hollow had ever expected to see. Hells Angels members, men whose faces appeared on FBI, wanted posters carefully wrapped Tank and Ryder in blankets under Margaret's supervision. They rigged makeshift stretchers from leather jackets and tree branches. They moved with surprising gentleness, following Margaret's instructions exactly. Support his neck, she told a biker named Diesel, whose arms were covered in prison tattoos. He might have cervical spine damage. Yes, ma'am. Keep pressure on that wound, she instructed another one called Reaper. Don't let it start bleeding again. Got it. They loaded Tank onto one bike with Diesel driving and another biker holding him steady. Ryder went on a second bike the same way. It wasn't ideal, but it was faster than waiting for an ambulance that might take hours in the snow. Before they left, Iron and Jack stood on Margaret's porch one more time. We owe you, he said quietly so only she could hear. The club doesn't forget debts. You don't owe me anything, Margaret replied. Just get those boys to a doctor. Still, Iron Jack insisted, you need anything, anything at all, you call this number. He handed her a card with nothing but a phone number written in black ink. Day or night will come. Margaret took the card. I'll keep that in mind. Iron Jack nodded once, then mounted his bike. The engines roared to life all at once, a sound like rolling thunder. Then the entire convoy was moving, heading down the mountain toward Pine Hollow General Hospital. Margaret stood on her porch and watched them go. When she finally turned around, she found herself facing an angry crowd. Karen pushed forward first, her face red and streaked with tears. How could you? How could you bring those criminals into our town, into your home? They were dying, Margaret started. They're murderers, Karen shrieked. Drug dealers, violent criminals, and you just invited them into our community like they're some kind of charity case. Tom stepped up beside his wife, his expression hard. Mom, Karen's right. You had no right to make this decision for all of us. Now we've got Hell's Angels crawling all over Pine Hollow. Our kids aren't safe. Nobody's safe. Your kids are perfectly safe, Margaret said firmly. How can you say that? Jenny Chen joined in, her voice shaking. My restaurant is 2 blocks from the hospital. What happens when those bikers decide they want free food, or when they decide to rob me? Or worse, more voices joined in. Fear was turning into anger into something uglier. Margaret could feel it building, could see it in their faces. They were looking at her like a stranger, like a traitor. Pastor Williams raised his hands, trying to calm everyone down. Please, let's all take a breath. She's lost her mind, Frank Morwood interrupted. The retired teacher's voice was sharp. That's what happens when you live alone too long. The isolation makes you crazy. She doesn't understand what she's done. I understand perfectly. Margaret said, her voice cutting through the chaos. I found 2 men freezing to death, and I saved them. That's what I understand. They're not men, Karen spat. They're animals. They're somebody's sons, Margaret's voice rose for the first time. Tank has a daughter, an 8-year-old little girl who hasn't seen her father in 2 years. Ryder grew up in foster care, bounced around the system, never had a family until the club took him in. They're broken and they've made terrible choices, but they're still human beings. You're defending them. Tom looked at her in disbelief. After everything they've done, I'm not defending their choices. I'm defending their right to live. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his face grim. Margaret, I need you to come down to the station and make a formal statement about what happened this morning. Am I under arrest? Not yet, but the county sheriff's office is going to want answers. And probably the FBI too, once word gets out you've been in contact with the Hells Angels. Margaret almost laughed. Contact Bradley, I saved their lives. That's not contact, that's basic human decency. That's not how the law sees it. Then the law is wrong. The crowd gasped. You didn't say things like that. Not to a sheriff, not in Pine Hollow. Bradley's jaw tightened. Margaret, I'll come make your statement. Margaret interrupted. But I'm not apologizing for what I did. Not to you, not to them, not to anyone. She walked to Bradley's patrol car and got in the back seat herself, not waiting to be escorted. The sheriff followed, shaking his head, and drove them down the mountain in tense silence. At the Pine Hollow Sheriff's Station, Margaret spent 3 hours answering questions. Yes, she'd found the bikers on Black Ridge Road. No, they hadn't threatened her. Yes, she'd treated their injuries. No, she didn't know what they were doing on the mountain. Yes, she'd allowed other Hells Angels into her cabin. No, she didn't feel she'd been in danger. Bradley typed everything up, printed it out, had her sign it. This is going to follow you, he said, quietly as she stood to leave. People are scared. They're going to treat you differently now. Let them, Margaret said. She walked out of the station and found her cabin completely empty of visitors for the first time in years. Usually neighbors stopped by with casseroles or just to chat. Not today. Today the mountain felt abandoned. Margaret made herself dinner canned soup heated on the stove and sat in Daniel's rocking chair as the sun went down. Her whole body ached from pulling the sled. Her heart ached from the accusations she'd faced. But Tank and Ryder were alive. That was enough. She was getting ready for bed when she heard the knock on her door. Margaret froze. It was past 9 o'clock. Nobody came up the mountain this late. She opened the door carefully. Ghost stood on her porch, his beard covered in ice crystals. "They're going to be okay," he said without preamble. "Tank's in the ICU. Ryder woke up an hour ago. Doctor said if you'd waited even 20 more minutes, they'd both be dead." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. "Good, that's good." Ghost shifted his weight uncomfortable. "The thing is, the club wants to do something for you, to say thank you. Jack's talking about bringing money or fixing up your cabin or—" "No," Margaret said firmly. "I don't want anything. Ma'am, with respect, that's not how this works. You saved two of our brothers. We have to—" "You don't have to do anything except get those boys healthy and keep them alive." Margaret's voice softened. "That's all the thanks I need." Ghost looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Ryder drew this," he said quietly, "before the painkillers knocked him out again. Said to give it to you." He handed her the paper and turned to leave. "Ghost," Margaret called after him. "Why were they on the mountain, Tank and Ryder? What were they doing up there at dawn?" Ghost stopped but didn't turn around. "Ryder's got a warrant out in Idaho. Bar fight went bad. He was running. Tank was helping him get across the state line." He paused. "They're not innocent, ma'am. I need you to understand that. They've done things, bad things. All of us have." "I know," Margaret said quietly. "Then why?" "Because 30 years ago, my husband Daniel stopped to help a stranger on the side of the road, and that stranger shot him and left him to die. Daniel survived, but he could have died right there in the dirt while people drove past thinking it wasn't their problem." Margaret's voice didn't waver. "I won't be the person who drives past. I won't decide someone isn't worth saving based on who I think they are." Ghost finally turned around. His eyes were wet. "You're a better person than most," he said. "I'm just a person," Margaret replied. "That's all any of us are." After Ghost left, Margaret unfolded the paper he'd given her. It was a pencil drawing, rough and hurried, but unmistakably talented. It showed an old woman pulling a sled through snow, her back bent with effort, her face set with determination. In the background, mountains rose against the sunrise sky. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, were 3 words, "Thank you, R." Margaret pressed the drawing to her chest and cried for the first time since Daniel's funeral. The next morning, she woke to find her front porch covered in flowers. Dozens of bouquets, all left anonymously during the night. No cards, no names, just flowers in the snow. The Hells Angels had been there. But so had someone else, because among the leather and chrome tributes were simple grocery store bouquets, the kind Pine Hollow residents left at funerals and hospital rooms. Someone from town had left those. Maybe more than one person. Not everyone thought she was crazy. Margaret gathered the flowers and brought them inside, arranging them in every container she owned. Her cabin smelled like spring in the middle of winter. She was making coffee when her phone rang. "Mrs. Whitmore," an unfamiliar female voice. "This is Cheryl Brennan from KPX News in Missoula. We've heard about what you did yesterday morning, and we'd love to come interview you for—" Margaret hung up. The phone rang again immediately. Different number, different reporter. She unplugged the phone. Over the next week, the story exploded. Local news became state news, became national news. Elderly Montana widow saves Hells Angels members, ran on CNN. Fox News did a segment about vigilante charity. MSNBC brought on a criminal justice expert to debate whether Margaret had obstructed justice. Reporters camped at the base of Black Ridge Road trying to get up to her cabin. The sheriff turned them all away. Margaret didn't watch any of it. She walked her mountain every morning, same as always. 5 miles up, 5 miles down. The snow eventually melted where Tank and Ryder had crashed, revealing broken chrome and shattered glass that glinted in the weak winter sunlight. She collected the pieces and buried them in her yard. On the 8th day after the rescue, Margaret returned from her morning walk to find Iron Jack Malone sitting on her porch steps. Alone. No motorcycle. No backup. Just the most feared biker in Montana sitting on an old woman's porch like he was waiting for his grandmother. "You're trespassing," Margaret said mildly. "I know." Jack stood up. "I needed to talk to you. Away from the club. Away from everyone." Margaret unlocked her door. "Coffee, please." They sat at her small kitchen table, the same one where she'd eaten breakfast with Daniel every morning for 20 years. Jack looked huge in the space, his leather jacket taking up half the room. Margaret poured coffee and waited. Tank's daughter came to visit him yesterday, Jack said finally. First time in 2 years. Her mother brought her to the hospital. They sat together for 3 hours. Tank cried the whole time. Margaret sipped her coffee and said nothing. Ryder's going back to school, Jack continued. Got accepted to the community college in Billings, art program, full scholarship. He showed them his drawings and they took him on the spot. That's good, Margaret said. It's more than good. It's a miracle. Jack's voice dropped. Do you know what we are, really? I know what you've done, or what people say you've done. We've done worse, Jack said bluntly. Me personally, I've hurt people, killed people, not in war, just because someone crossed the club or we needed to send a message. He looked at his hands scarred and calloused. I'm not a good man, Mrs. Whitmore. Neither is Tank. Neither is Ryder. We're criminals. The FBI is right about us. Then why are you telling me this? Jack raised his eyes to meet hers. Because you saved them anyway, and I need to understand why. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the steam rise from her coffee cup. My Daniel, she said finally, believed that everyone deserved a chance at redemption. Even people who'd done terrible things. Especially people who'd done terrible things because they're the ones who need it most. She smiled sadly. He was murdered by someone he was trying to help. Shot point blank and left for dead. And you know what his last words to me were in the hospital? Jack shook his head. Don't let this make you hard, Maggie. Don't let it make you cruel. He made me promise that I'd keep seeing the good in people, even when it was buried deep. Margaret's voice broke slightly. So that's what I do. I keep my promise. Jack stared at her. Then slowly this hard man who'd spent 20 years terrorizing communities across Montana put his head in his hands and sobbed. Margaret let him cry. When he finally stopped, he wiped his face with his sleeve and stood up. The club's making changes, he said roughly. No more drugs, no more guns for hire. We're going clean, or as clean as we can get. Because of what I did. Because of what you showed us. Jack moved toward the door. You treated us like we mattered, like we were worth saving. Nobody's done that since, I can't remember when, maybe never. He paused with his hand on the doorknob. We're going to prove you weren't wrong about us, Mrs. Whitmore. We're going to prove we can be better. Then he was gone, his footsteps crunching through snow down the mountain. Margaret sat alone in her kitchen and cried again. But this time they were tears of hope. 3 weeks after Iron Jack's visit, Margaret walked into Henderson's general store, and the entire place went silent. She'd needed groceries, simple as that. Flour, sugar, coffee, the basics she couldn't grow or make herself. She'd been shopping at Henderson's for 30 years, knew every aisle by heart, knew which floorboards creaked, and where old Mr. Henderson kept the good canned peaches in the back. But today felt different. Mary Henderson stood behind the counter, her hands frozen on the cash register. 2 other customers, the Walsh sisters, who ran the bed and breakfast, stopped mid-conversation and stared. Even young Tommy Rodriguez, who was stocking shelves, went completely still. Morning, Mary, Margaret said calmly, picking up a shopping basket. Mary didn't respond. She just watched Margaret like she was a stranger, like she was dangerous. Margaret moved through the store, selecting items, placing them in her basket. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The Walsh sisters edged toward the door and left without buying anything, the bell above the entrance jingling in the oppressive silence. When Margaret brought her basket to the counter, Mary rang up the items without looking at her. Her hands shook slightly as she bagged the groceries. That'll be $43.60. Mary said, her voice flat. Margaret pulled out her wallet. Mary, are we going to talk about this? Nothing to talk about. I've known you since you were born. Your mother and I were best friends. You're going to treat me like a stranger now. Mary finally looked up, and Margaret saw fear in her eyes. Real deep fear. They came here, Mary whispered. Last week, 3 of them. Just walked in like they owned the place. Bought beer and cigarettes. One of them had a gun in his waistband. I saw it. Did they threaten you? They didn't have to. Everyone knows what they are, what they do. Mary's voice cracked. My daughter Emily is 16, Margaret. 16. And now we've got Hell's Angels walking our streets because you brought them here. I didn't bring them anywhere. They came for their own. And they're staying because of you. Mary's voice rose sharply. Don't you see? You made this town safe for them. You gave them permission to be here. And now my daughter isn't safe in her own home." Margaret felt the words like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond, but what could she say? Mary wasn't entirely wrong. The Hells Angels' presence in Pine Hollow had increased. They came to visit Tank at the hospital. They stopped at the diner for meals. They filled up at the gas station. They were here. Margaret paid for her groceries and left without another word. Outside, the morning sun was bright on the snow-covered street. Pine Hollow looked peaceful, quaint like a postcard of small-town Montana. But Margaret could feel the tension underneath, thick as fog. People crossed the street to avoid her. Curtains twitched in windows as she passed. The hardware store owner locked his door even though his open sign was still lit. She was loading groceries into her old pickup truck when she heard the motorcycles. 4 Harleys rolled down Main Street, engines rumbling. Margaret recognized Ghost on the lead bike. The others she didn't know, but they all wore the skull and wings patch. They pulled up in front of her truck. Ghost removed his helmet. "Mrs. Whitmore, good to see you." "Ghost." Margaret continued loading her groceries, keeping her voice neutral. "How's Ryder?" "Good. Real good. He's out of the hospital staying at the clubhouse while he heals up." Ghost gestured to the other bikers. "This is Wrench, Hammer, and Tiny. They wanted to meet you." Tiny, who was absolutely massive, at least 6'6", nodded respectfully. "Ma'am, we heard what you did for Tank and Ryder. That took guts." "It took basic human decency," Margaret corrected. Wrench laughed, a harsh sound. "Ain't nothing basic about it. Most people would have left them to freeze." Margaret closed the truck's tailgate with more force than necessary. "Was there something you needed, or are you just here to chat?" Ghost's smile faded. He'd picked up on her tone. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "You don't sound fine." "I'm fine," Margaret repeated harder this time. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get home." She climbed into her truck and started the engine. In her rearview mirror, she could see the 4 bikers watching her drive away confused. She also saw Mary Henderson standing in the store window, her face pale, her phone pressed to her ear. Calling someone. Probably the sheriff. Margaret drove up Black Ridge Road feeling more alone than she'd felt since Daniel died. That evening, Sheriff Bradley knocked on her cabin door. "Come in, Bradley," Margaret called from her rocking chair. "Door's open." The sheriff entered, removing his hat. He looked tired, older than his 45 years. "Got a call from Mary Henderson today," he said without preamble. "Said the Hells Angels were harassing you in front of the general store." Margaret snorted. "Harassing, they said hello." That's not how Mary saw it. Mary's scared, everyone's scared, but being scared doesn't make them right. Bradley sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "Margaret, I need you to understand something. The Hells Angels' presence in Pine Hollow has tripled in the last 3 weeks. We've had 5 confirmed members move into the old Morrison building on 3rd Street. They've set up what looks like a permanent clubhouse. So the town is terrified. Parents are keeping kids home from school. Businesses are closing early. Jenny Chen hired private security for her restaurant." Bradley leaned forward. "You opened a door, Margaret, and now we can't close it. Maybe it needed to be opened." "For God's sake!" Bradley stopped himself, taking a breath. "Do you know what Tank Mercer did in 2019? He put a man in the hospital for 3 months. Beat him so badly he had to relearn how to walk. And Ryder, he's got warrants in 2 states. These aren't misunderstood kids, Margaret. They're violent criminals who deserve to die in the snow, who deserve to face justice. And if they'd frozen to death, where would the justice be in that?" Margaret's voice was steel. "You want me to apologize for saving lives, Bradley? I won't. Not to you, not to Mary, not to anyone." Bradley stood up, frustrated. "The FBI is asking questions. They want to know if you've been in contact with the club beyond the initial rescue, if you've passed information, if you're involved in any of their activities." Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm 79 years old and I live alone on a mountain. What exactly do they think I'm involved in? I'm just telling you what I'm hearing." Bradley moved toward the door. "Watch yourself, Margaret. You've made enemies, in town and outside it." After he left, Margaret sat in the growing darkness, not bothering to turn on any lights. The cabin felt cold despite the fire crackling in the stone fireplace. She was still sitting there when she heard the crash. Glass exploded inward from her front window, spraying across the floor. A rock the size of a baseball skittered to a stop near her feet. There was paper wrapped around it, held in place with rubber bands. Margaret's heart hammered as she grabbed her phone and dialed Bradley. "Sheriff's office. Someone just threw a rock through my window." Bradley was at her cabin in 15 minutes, lights flashing. He examined the broken window, photographed the rock, carefully unwrapped the paper. His face went white as he read it. "What does it say?" Margaret asked. Bradley showed her. In crude block letters, "Angel Lover, leave Pine Hollow or die." Margaret stared at the words, her hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, from rage. "This is a direct threat," Bradley said. "I'm calling in deputies. You can't stay here alone, and I'm not leaving my home." "Margaret, this is where Daniel and I built our life. This is where he died. This is where I'll die too when my time comes." She met Bradley's eyes. "I'm not running because some coward threw a rock." Bradley argued for 20 minutes, but Margaret was immovable. Finally, he left 2 deputies stationed at the base of her road with instructions to check on her every hour. Margaret spent the night cleaning up broken glass, listening to every sound outside, fighting the fear that kept trying to crawl up her throat. She didn't sleep. At dawn, she went for her walk anyway. 5 miles up Black Ridge Road, 5 miles back down. Her daily routine, her anchor. When she returned to her cabin, there were more flowers on her porch, but also something else. A leather jacket, Hell's Angels colors, draped over her rocking chair, and sitting on the seat was a handgun in a holster. A note was pinned to the jacket. "Nobody threatens our family. We're watching Iron Jack." Margaret stared at the gun. She'd fired plenty of weapons in her Army days, knew how to use them, but she'd never kept one in her home. Daniel had always said that guns brought more death than they prevented. She picked up the weapon, felt its weight, then set it back down. The jacket, though, she looked at it for a long time. The skull and wings patch glared back at her. If she wore this, she'd be making a statement, choosing a side, becoming something she'd never been. But she'd already made her choice, hadn't she? The moment she'd pulled Tank and Ryder from the snow. Margaret left both items on the porch and went inside. 2 days later, Tank was released from the hospital. Margaret heard about it from Ghost, who stopped by her cabin that evening. "He wants to see you," Ghost said, "to thank you properly, but he's scared you won't want to see him." "Why would I not want to see him?" "Because of what's happening in town. The rock through your window. People treating you like you've got the plague." Ghost's expression was grim. Tank blames himself, says he's destroyed your life by surviving. Margaret felt her chest tighten. "Tell him to come tomorrow morning. 7 o'clock. I'll make breakfast." Ghost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Tank arrived exactly at 7, riding in a pickup truck, driven by another club member. He moved slowly, still healing, one arm in a sling. When he stepped onto her porch, Margaret could see the changes in him. He'd lost weight. His eyes were clearer. He looked younger somehow, despite the injuries. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I don't even know how to start." "With coffee," Margaret interrupted. "Coffee first, talking second." She led him inside and poured 2 cups. They sat at her kitchen table in silence for a moment. "Your daughter visited you," Margaret said finally. "Ghost told me." Tank's eyes filled with tears immediately. "Yeah, Sarah. She's 8 now, beautiful, smart, looks just like her mother." His voice broke. "I've been such a piece of shit. Missing birthdays, holidays, every important moment because I was drunk or high or in jail or just too scared to face what I'd become. And now I'm terrified I have waited too long. That she'll never forgive me. That I don't deserve forgiveness." Tank wiped his eyes roughly. "But I'm going to trauma. I'm moving to Billings, getting a boy, staying clean. Her mother said if I can prove I'm stable for 6 months, she'll consider shared custody." "That's good," Margaret said. "That's really good." "It's because of you." Tank looked at her directly. "You saved my life, but more than that, you showed me I was worth saving. Nobody's ever done that. Not my parents, not the Army, not even the club, just you." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "You are worth saving, Tank. You always were. You just forgot." They sat like that for a long moment, this broken biker and the old woman who'd refused to let him die. Then Tank said something that changed everything. "There's trouble coming," he said quietly. "Bad trouble. The club's going clean like Jack told you. But not everyone's happy about it. There's a chapter out of Idaho, the Ironwood chapter. They're old school, violent. They think we've gone soft. They're saying Jack's weak for listening to an old woman. They're saying we've betrayed what the club stands for. Margaret's stomach went cold. What does that mean? It means they're coming here, to Pine Hollow, to prove a point. Tank's grip tightened on her hand. And they're coming for you, Mrs. Whitmore. They think if they hurt you, they'll hurt Jack. They'll show everyone that compassion is weakness. When we don't know, could be days, could be weeks, but it's happening. Tank stood up. Jack's got people watching your cabin. We won't let them touch you. But I needed you to know. I needed you to understand what you're in the middle of. After Tank left, Margaret sat alone in her cabin and finally allowed herself to feel afraid. She'd been shot at in Vietnam. She'd watched her husband nearly die. She'd faced down illness, poverty, loneliness, grief. But this was different. This was a storm she'd created by being kind, and now innocent people might get caught in it. She thought about leaving, packing up and moving to Missoula to live with Karen and Tom, getting out before things got worse. But that would mean abandoning Tank and Ryder and everyone else who'd started believing they could be better. It would mean proving the Ironwood chapter right, that compassion was weakness. Margaret walked to her bedroom and opened the closet. In the back behind her winter coats was a box she hadn't touched in 40 years. She pulled it out, brushed off the dust, and opened it. Inside were her Army medals, her discharge papers, photos of her in uniform, young and strong and unbreakable. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was Daniel's service pistol. She'd forgotten he'd kept it, forgotten it was even here. Margaret lifted the weapon, carefully checked it. Still functional. She found the ammunition in the box, too old, but probably still good. She loaded the gun with hands that didn't shake and set it on her nightstand. Then she went to bed and slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The next morning, she woke to the sound of motorcycles. Lots of them. Margaret grabbed the pistol and moved to her window, heart racing. But instead of the Ironwood chapter, she saw something impossible. At least 20 Hells Angels bikes were parked around her cabin. Not threatening, protecting. They'd formed a perimeter, watching the road, watching the tree line. Iron Jack stood on her porch waiting. Margaret opened the door, pistol still in her hand. Jack's eyes went to the weapon, then back to her face. He smiled slightly. Good, he said. You're ready. Ready for what? To fight. Jack's expression went serious. The Ironwood chapter contacted us last night. They're riding in tomorrow. 25 members, all of them looking for blood. They've made it clear they're coming for you first, then for us. Why me? Because you represent everything they hate. You showed weakness to the enemy. You treated us like we mattered. In their world, that makes you a target. Jack's jaw tightened. But they're going to have to go through every member of the Montana chapter to get to you. And we won't let that happen. Margaret looked at the bikers surrounding her cabin. Men she'd feared 3 weeks ago. Men who were now willing to die to protect her. This is insane, she whispered. Yeah, Jack agreed. It is, but it's happening. A younger biker approached the porch, someone Margaret didn't recognize. He was maybe 25, covered in tattoos with eyes that had seen too much. Jack, we've got movement on the South Road. Looks like scouts. Jack nodded. Get everyone in position. Nobody fires unless fired upon. We're not starting this fight. The young biker ran off. Jack turned back to Margaret. You should go inside. Stay away from windows. We've got... No, Margaret said firmly. Excuse me. I said no. This is my home, my mountain. I'm not hiding. Mrs. Whitmore, with all respect, I was pulling bullets out of 19-year-old boys while mortars fell around me. Margaret interrupted, her voice hard. I've seen real war, Jack. Don't ask me to hide now. Jack stared at her, then slowly smiled. Yes, ma'am. He called out to the other bikers. Get Mrs. Whitmore a vest and a radio. She's with us. Within minutes, Margaret was wearing a bulletproof vest 3 sizes too big and holding a radio that crackled with static, intense voices. The bikers had spread out around her property, creating defensive positions using fallen logs and snowbanks. It looked professional military. Where'd you learn tactics? Margaret asked Jack. Marines, 2 tours in Iraq. He checked his own weapon, a massive pistol holstered at his side. Half the club are veterans. We know how to defend a position. The radio crackled. Movement confirmed. 5 bikes heading up Black Ridge Road. Jack keyed his radio. Let them come. Nobody engages until I give the word. Margaret's heart was racing now. She could hear the motorcycles approaching, their engines echoing through the valley. 5 bikes became 10. 10 became 15. They stopped just beyond the tree line, out of sight but close enough that everyone could feel their presence. A single rider emerged from the trees and rode slowly toward Margaret's cabin. He stopped 50 feet away, killed his engine, and dismounted. He was older than most of the bikers Margaret had met, maybe 60, with gray in his beard and scars across his face. His leather jacket bore the same Hells Angels patch, but with different chapter markings, Ironwood, Idaho. "Iron Jack Malone," he called out, "come talk with me. Or are you hiding behind an old woman now?" Jack stepped forward, hands visible and empty. "I'm here, Cage. Say what you came to say." Cage, the Ironwood president, looked around at the defensive positions, at the bikers ready to fight, at Margaret, standing on her porch in an oversized bulletproof vest. Then he laughed. "This is what you've become." Cage's voice dripped contempt. "Playing soldier for some old lady who feels sorry for you. The Montana chapter used to be feared. Now you're a goddamn charity case." "We're evolving," Jack said calmly. "Getting out of the life. Going legitimate." "Legitimate," Cage spat in the snow. "There's no such thing as a legitimate Hells Angel. We're outlaws. Always have been. Always will be. That's the whole point." "Maybe the point is wrong." Cage's expression went cold. "You've betrayed everything this club stands for. You've disrespected the patch. You've made us all look weak." He pointed at Margaret. "Because of her. Because you let some civilian tell you how to live." "She didn't tell us anything," Jack replied. "She showed us something different, something better." "There is nothing better," Cage was shouting now. "This is who we are, and if you've forgotten that, then you don't deserve to wear those colors." The tension was unbearable. Margaret could feel it building like pressure before a storm. Fingers were on triggers, breathing was shallow. Then Ryder stepped out of the cabin behind Margaret. He moved slowly, still injured, but his voice carried clearly across the snow. "My whole life," Ryder said, "I was told I was worthless. Foster homes, jails, the streets, everyone saw me the same way. A problem, a waste, something to be controlled or locked away or ignored." He looked at Cage. "The club gave me a family. You're right about that. But Mrs. Whitmore gave me something the club never did." "What's that?" Cage sneered. "Hope." The word hung in the cold morning air. Ryder continued. "She pulled me out of the snow, and she didn't care who I was or what I'd done. She just cared that I was dying. And that changed everything." His voice strengthened. "I start college next month. Art program. I'm going to teach kids someday. Kids like me who think they're worthless. And I'm going to show them they're not." Cage stared at him. "You're a traitor. I'm someone who finally believes I'm worth something." More bikers emerged from the cabin. Tank, Ghost, Diesel, Tiny Wrench, Hammer. All the men who'd been changed by Margaret's simple act of kindness. They stood together facing their former brothers. "We're not traitors," Tank said. "We're just finally becoming who we should have been all along." Cage looked at them with disgust. Then he pulled a gun from his jacket. Everything happened at once. 20 weapons came up from the Montana chapter. Radio chatter exploded. Someone yelled contact, and the entire defensive perimeter tensed for battle. But Cage didn't aim the gun at anyone. He dropped it in the snow. "I'm not killing you," he said quietly, his voice shaking with rage. "That would be mercy. Instead, I'm going to let you live with what you've become. Soft, weak, pathetic." He looked directly at Jack. "You're out, all of you. As of today, the Montana chapter is expelled from the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. You don't get to wear those patches anymore. You don't get to use the name. You're nothing." Jack stepped forward. "We'll survive." "Will you?" Cage smiled cruelly. "Because every other chapter is going to know what happened here. Every other club will know you chose an old woman over your brothers. You'll be hunted, targeted, destroyed, and nobody will help you." He mounted his bike, started the engine. "Enjoy your new life," he called over the rumble. "However long it lasts." Then he and the Ironwood chapter roared away, disappearing down the mountain road. Silence fell over Margaret's cabin. The Montana bikers slowly lowered their weapons, looking at each other, processing what had just happened. They'd been kicked out, expelled, Everything they'd built their identity round for years gone. Margaret expected anger, grief, maybe violence. Instead, Ghost started laughing. It was a shocked, disbelieving laugh that spread to Tiny, then Wrench, then the others. Soon the entire group was laughing, some wiping tears from their eyes. "We're free," Tank said wonderingly. "Holy shit, we're actually free." Jack pulled the Hells Angels patch off his jacket and looked at it for a long moment. Then he handed it to Margaret. "You want to know the truth?" he said quietly. "I've been waiting for an excuse to walk away for 10 years. I was just too scared to do it alone." He smiled. "But I'm not alone anymore." One by one, the other bikers removed their patches and laid them in a pile at Margaret's feet. 20 men letting go of their past, choosing something different. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked. Jack looked around at his brothers. "We're still a club, still a family. We'll just be something better. Help people instead of hurt them. Build instead of destroy." He met her eyes. "We'll prove you weren't wrong about us, Mrs. Whitmore. I promise you that." Margaret looked at the pile of patches at these men who'd found courage she didn't know they had. "You already have," she said softly. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Margaret stood on her porch and watched the former Hells Angels ride away. Not in formation, not as an outlaw motorcycle club, just as men heading home to start their lives over. She picked up one of the discarded patches and held it, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Then she went inside, made herself dinner, and sat in Daniel's rocking chair. "I think you'd be proud of them," she said to the empty room. "I think you'd be proud of all of us." Outside, the mountain was peaceful. The war was over, and somehow impossibly kindness had won. But peace never lasts as long as you hope it will. Margaret learned that truth again 2 weeks later when she walked into Pine Hollow and found the town had split completely in half. On one side of Main Street, businesses had put up signs, "We support Margaret Whitmore." The diner, the library, the small bookstore, even Dr. Patterson's medical clinic. They'd formed what they were calling the Compassion Coalition, and they weren't backing down. On the other side, different signs appeared: "Pine Hollow Families First," and "Our Children's Safety Matters." Henderson's General Store led that group, along with the Methodist Church, the elementary school board, and most of the longtime residents. The town that had lived in quiet harmony for decades was tearing itself apart. Margaret stood in the middle of Main Street, looking at the division she'd caused, and felt sick. Pastor Williams found her standing there, tears streaming down her face. "Margaret," he said gently, touching her shoulder, "this isn't your fault." "How can you say that? Look at what I've done to this community." "You saved 2 lives, that's all." Williams gestured at the signs, the divisions. This is fear talking. Fear of change, fear of the unknown, fear of people who look different or act different. That fear was always here. You just brought it to the surface. "I should leave," Margaret whispered. "If I left, maybe things would go back to normal." "Things were never normal. We just pretended they were." Williams smiled sadly. "Besides, you've got more support than you think." He was right. Over the next few days, Margaret discovered she had allies she'd never expected. Jenny Chen from the Chinese restaurant showed up at her cabin with enough food for a week. "My grandfather was Chinese immigrant in 1950s, Jenny said, setting containers on Margaret's table. "Everyone feared him, called him communist spy dangerous. But one woman, Mrs. Dorothy Hughes, she hired him at her boarding house, gave him chance." Jenny's eyes were fierce. "Mrs. Hughes died 30 years ago, but I never forgot. You remind me of her, so I help you now." Dr. Patterson came next, bringing medical supplies. "I've been treating some of your former bikers," he said quietly. "Tank Rider, few others. They're getting counseling, going to AA meetings, actually trying to change. I've been a doctor for 30 years, Margaret. I know the difference between people pretending and people truly transforming. What you started is real." Even young Tommy Rodriguez from the general store showed up looking nervous. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not supposed to be here. Mr. Henderson said anyone who visits you gets fired." Tommy shifted his weight, anxious. "But I need to tell you something. My brother Carlos, he's been in and out of jail since he was 15. Drugs, gangs, violence. Everyone gave up on him. Everyone except you." "I've never met your brother," Margaret said, confused. "I know, but Carlos has. He's friends with Ghost. And when Ghost told him what you did, how you saved Tank and Ryder, even though you knew they were criminals, something changed in Carlos." Tommy's voice broke. He checked himself into rehab 2 weeks ago. First time he's ever voluntarily sought help. He said if an old lady could see worth in bikers, maybe there was worth in him too. Tommy pulled an envelope from his pocket and pressed it into Margaret's hands. He wanted me to give you this, and I wanted to say thank you. You saved my brother without even knowing it. After Tommy left, Margaret opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with childlike handwriting. Dear Mrs. Whitmore, you don't know me, but you saved my life. Thank you for showing me people can change. I'm going to make you proud. Carlos Rodriguez. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest and cried. But not everyone was grateful. That night, someone spray-painted "Traitor" across her mailbox. The next morning, she found her truck's tires slashed. Sheriff Bradley increased patrols, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. The harassment escalated when Margaret went to the post office to mail a letter to her sister in Oregon. The building went silent as she entered. People turned their backs. The postal clerk, a woman named Susan who'd worked there for 20 years, refused to make eye contact. I need 3 stamps, please, Margaret said quietly. Susan didn't move, just stood there, arms crossed. Susan, I know you're upset, but I need to mail this letter. We have the right to refuse service, Susan said loudly, making sure everyone heard. And I'm refusing. Margaret felt heat rise in her face. This is a federal post office. You can't refuse to sell stamps. Watch me. The other customers who were watching, now some with satisfaction, others with discomfort. An elderly man named Robert Chen Jenny's father stepped forward. I'll buy stamps for Mrs. Whitmore, he said firmly. Then you're no longer welcome here either, Susan snapped. Robert bought the stamps anyway and handed them to Margaret. They walked out together while Susan shouted about calling the police. This town has lost its mind, Robert muttered, treating you like criminal for saving lives. People are scared, Margaret said, though the words felt hollow. People are stupid. Big difference. The real breaking point came 3 days later at the town council meeting. Margaret hadn't planned to attend, but Dr. Patterson convinced her. They're voting on a resolution, he explained, officially condemning your actions and requesting you relocate outside Pine Hollow city limits. You need to be there to defend yourself. The high school gymnasium was packed. Every seat filled people standing along the walls. Margaret entered and the room erupted in noise, half booing, half cheering. She'd never felt more exposed in her life. Mayor Richard Thornton banged his gavel. We'll have order. The meeting began with 3 council members presenting their resolution. Councilwoman Sarah Mitchell led the charge. Margaret Whitmore's actions have brought criminal elements into our peaceful community. Sarah read from her prepared statement. Her reckless compassion has endangered our children, our businesses, and our way of life. We therefore move to formally condemn her actions and strongly encourage her voluntary relocation. The room exploded in applause from one side, angry shouts from the other. Mayor Thornton banged his gavel again. Mrs. Whitmore, you have 5 minutes to respond, if you wish. Margaret stood up, her legs shaking. She walked to the microphone at the front of the room and looked out at the divided crowd. People she'd known for 30 years. People whose children she'd babysat. People whose parents she'd nursed through final illnesses. People who now looked at her like she was a monster. I'm not going to apologize, she said quietly, and the room went silent. You want me to say I'm sorry for saving Tank and Ryder's lives, but I won't. Because I'm not sorry. I'd do it again tomorrow. Angry muttering rippled through the crowd. But I am sorry for the fear I've caused. I'm sorry your children are scared. I'm sorry businesses feel threatened. I'm sorry this town is divided. Margaret's voice strengthened. I'm sorry because I know what fear does to people. I watched it destroy villages in Vietnam. I watched it turn neighbors into enemies. And I'm watching it happen here now. We have a right to be afraid, someone shouted from the back. You do, Margaret agreed, but fear doesn't give you the right to be cruel. Fear doesn't make hate acceptable. She looked at Sarah Mitchell. You want me to leave? Fine. Pass your resolution. But know that you're not protecting your children by teaching them that some people don't deserve compassion. You're teaching them that love has limits, that kindness has conditions, that some lives matter less than others. Mary Henderson stood up, her face red. Those men are criminals. They've hurt people, killed people. How can you defend them? I'm not defending their crimes, Margaret said firmly. I'm defending their humanity. There's a difference. She paused. Tank has a daughter, 8 years old. Her name is Sarah. Should I have let her father freeze to death in the snow? Should I have made her an orphan because he made bad choices? The room went quiet. Ryder grew up in foster care, Margaret continued, bounced between 14 different homes before he aged out at 18. Nobody wanted him. Nobody believed in him. Until the club took him in, and yes, the club taught him terrible things. But now he's in college studying art planning to teach kids who feel as worthless as he once did. Should I have let him die before he got that chance? Tears were streaming down Margaret's face now, but she didn't wipe them away. I know these men have done terrible things. I know they've hurt people, but I also know that every single one of them is somebody's son, somebody's father, somebody's brother. And if we decide that some people aren't worth saving, then we become the very thing we're afraid of. She stepped away from the microphone and sat down. The gymnasium was completely silent. Then slowly Jenny Chen stood up. Then Dr. Patterson. Then Robert Chen. Then Tommy Rodriguez, who'd risked his job to be there. Then Pastor Williams. One by one, Margaret's supporters rose to their feet in silent solidarity. But the other side stayed seated, more than half the room. Mayor Thornton called for a vote. The resolution passed 5 votes to 2. Margaret was officially condemned by her own town. She walked out of the gymnasium with her head high, but once she was in her truck, she broke down completely, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to earth. She was still crying when someone knocked on her window. It was Tank. He'd been standing in the back of the gymnasium the whole time, Margaret realized, listening to everything. His face was wet with tears, too. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said through the glass, "I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. If I hadn't crashed, if you hadn't found us." Margaret rolled down the window. "Don't you dare apologize for surviving. But look what it's cost you, your whole life here." "I chose this," Margaret interrupted. "Nobody forced me. I saw 2 men dying and I made a choice. I'd make it again." Tank wiped his eyes roughly. "I don't deserve what you did for me. None of us do. Deserve has nothing to do with it." Margaret reached out and grabbed his hand. "Tank, are you staying sober? 90 days clean? Are you seeing your daughter every weekend? Her mother's starting to trust me again." "Then that's enough. That's all the thanks I need." A pickup truck pulled up beside them. Ryder was driving Ghost in the passenger seat. Both of them had been at the meeting too, Margaret realized, supporting her from the shadows. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ryder called out, "we're not letting you go home alone tonight. Not after what just happened." "I'm fine." "With respect, ma'am, you're not fine. None of this is fine." Ghost opened his door and stepped out. "The whole club, former club, we're all heading to your cabin. We're staying until things calm down." "You can't do that. You have jobs, families." "We'll rotate shifts," Tank said firmly. "Nobody's letting you face this alone. You didn't leave us to die. We're not leaving you to suffer." Margaret wanted to argue, but she was too tired, too broken, so she just nodded and let them follow her up Black Ridge Road. That night, her cabin was full of former bikers. They brought sleeping bags, food supplies. They set up a watch rotation. They made her dinner and wouldn't let her argue. Jack sat with her on the porch while the others settled in. "This is insane," Margaret said quietly. "All of this. I just wanted to save 2 lives." "You saved more than 2, Jack replied. "You saved all of us. You just didn't know it yet. At what cost? The town hates me. My own daughter-in-law won't speak to me. I'm officially condemned by the city council." "Do you regret it?" Margaret thought about Tank seeing his daughter again, about Ryder going to college, about Carlos Rodriguez checking into rehab, about all the lives that had changed because she'd refused to walk past 2 dying men. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it." "Then you've already won." Over the next 2 weeks, something unexpected happened. The former bikers didn't just protect Margaret, they started helping the town. When the elementary school's heating system broke during a cold snap, Wrench and Diesel fixed it for free. When Mrs. Patterson fell and broke her hip, Ghost drove her to the hospital and sat with her through surgery. When the community center's roof started leaking, Tank and 5 others spent 3 days replacing it, refusing payment. At first, people were suspicious. Some still refused the help. But slowly, gradually, the fear began to crack. The real shift came when a massive snowstorm hit Pine Hollow. 3 feet of snow fell in 2 days, trapping people in their homes, cutting power lines, making roads impassable. The town was in crisis. Margaret was in her cabin when Jack got the emergency call on his radio. "We've got a situation," he said, standing up fast. "Family trapped on Old Mill Road. Parents and 3 kids. House is freezing, no heat, phones are dead." They called for help before the lines went down. "Who is it?" Margaret asked. Jack's face was grim. "The Henderson family. Mary and her husband and kids. The same Mary who'd refused to serve Margaret at the store. The same Mary who'd led the opposition against her. The same Mary whose fear had poisoned half the town." "We're going," Jack said, immediately calling the others. "Grab the snowmobiles and medical supplies. Now." Within minutes, they were geared up and heading out. Margaret grabbed her old medical kit and insisted on coming. "Mrs. Whitmore, you can't," Tank started. "Those are children trapped in the cold," Margaret said firmly. "I'm coming." They rode snowmobiles through the blizzard, visibility near zero temperature dropping fast. Margaret held tight to Ghost, her face buried against his back, to block the wind. When they reached the Henderson house, they found it dark and silent. Jack pounded on the door. "Mary, it's Jack Malone. We're here to help." No answer. He tried the door locked. He pounded again. "Mary, your kids are in danger. Open the door." Finally, a weak voice from inside. "Go away." "Mary, we have blankets, heat sources, medical supplies. Let us help." "I don't want your help. I don't want you near my children." Jack looked at Margaret, frustrated and angry. Behind the door, they could hear one of the kids crying. Margaret stepped forward and spoke loudly. "Mary, it's Margaret Whitmore. I know you hate me. I know you're scared. But your children are in danger. Please let us help them." "Silence, then. You brought these people here. You brought this danger to our town. I know you believe that, and we can argue about it later. But right now, your daughter is crying, and I can hear her teeth chattering from out here. Please, Mary, please let us save your children." More silence. Then the lock clicked. The door opened slowly. Mary stood there, pale and shaking, her 3 children huddled behind her. The youngest was maybe 5, lips turning blue, wrapped in every blanket they owned. "Help them," Mary whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please help my babies." The former bikers moved into action with military precision. Tank got the generator running. Wrench started a fire in the fireplace. Diesel checked the kids for hypothermia while Margaret examined each one carefully. The youngest, a little girl named Emma, was in bad shape. Body temperature dangerously low, barely responsive. "We need to get her warm, fast," Margaret said, wrapping Emma in thermal blankets. "Skin-to-skin contact is best. Mary, get under these blankets with her." Mary climbed in, holding her daughter, crying and praying. Ghost heated water for hot chocolate. Ryder found the kids' favorite stuffed animals and tucked them in. Jack made sure the generator would last through the night. They worked for hours, slowly bringing warmth back to the frozen house, slowly bringing color back to the children's faces. Finally, around midnight, Emma opened her eyes and smiled. "Mama," she said sleepily, "I'm warm now." Mary broke down, completely sobbing into her daughter's hair. Margaret left her to it and walked into the kitchen where Jack was making coffee. "She's going to be okay," Margaret said quietly. "Thanks to you." Jack poured 2 cups. "You know Mary's still going to hate you tomorrow, right? Fear doesn't disappear overnight." "I know, but maybe it'll crack a little." They were both wrong. The next morning, Mary Henderson went to every house in Pine Hollow that would listen and told them what had happened. How the people she'd feared most had saved her children. How the criminals she'd condemned had shown more compassion than most of the upstanding citizens who'd passed her house without checking if she was okay. Within a week, 3 more families who'd opposed Margaret publicly apologized. Within 2 weeks, the Pine Hollow family's first group officially disbanded. The town council called an emergency meeting and voted to rescind their condemnation of Margaret Whitmore. Sarah Mitchell personally drove to Margaret's cabin to apologize. "I was wrong," she said simply, standing on the porch. "I let fear control me. I'm sorry." Margaret invited her in for coffee, but not everything was healing. That same week, Margaret got a letter in the mail. No return address, just a single sheet of paper with a message typed in capital letters. "You think you've won. You haven't. The Ironwood chapter doesn't forgive. We're coming back, and next time we won't just talk." Margaret showed the letter to Jack. His face went white. "They're not done with us. What do? We prepare for war. But before war could come, Something else happened that changed everything. Tank's daughter Sarah was walking home from school when a car pulled up beside her. The driver leaned out the window. "Hey, sweetie, your dad sent me to pick you up. Hop in." Sarah, only 8 years old, but smart, started to back away. The man got out of the car. He was wearing a leather jacket with ironwood chapter patches. "I said, get in the car," he growled, reaching for her. Sarah screamed. Tommy Rodriguez was closing up the general store across the street. He heard the scream, looked up, and saw what was happening. He ran. Tommy had never been in a fight in his life. He was 22 years old, skinny, scared of conflict. But he saw a little girl in danger, and he ran straight at the biker without thinking. "Leave her alone," Tommy shouted. The biker turned, saw this kid running at him, and laughed. He pulled a knife. Tommy didn't stop. He tackled the biker, both of them crashing to the pavement. The knife clattered away. Sarah ran screaming for help. The biker was bigger, stronger, meaner. He got on top of Tommy and started hitting him, fists connecting with bone blood spraying. That's when the entire town responded. Robert Chen came running from his restaurant. Pastor Williams sprinted from the church. Dr. Patterson abandoned his clinic. Even Mary Henderson grabbed a baseball bat from her store and came charging. They pulled the ironwood biker off Tommy and held him down until Sheriff Bradley arrived. The biker was arrested. Tommy was rushed to the hospital with a broken nose and fractured ribs, and Sarah was safe. Tank arrived at the hospital 20 minutes later, having driven 90 miles an hour from Billings when he got the call. He found Tommy in the emergency room, face swollen but alive. "You saved my daughter," Tank said, his voice breaking. "You risked your life for her." Tommy tried to smile through split lips. "She's just a kid. Of course I did. Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have called the cops and watched." "Then most people are wrong." Tank sat beside Tommy's hospital bed and cried. This kid who he'd never met, who'd never worn a patch or thrown a punch, who worked at a general store and lived with his parents, this kid had more courage than most of the hardened criminals Tank had known. "Thank you," Tank whispered. "Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like." News of the attempted kidnapping spread through Pine Hollow like wildfire. The Ironwood chapter had crossed a line they'd gone after a child. That night, something unprecedented happened. The entire town gathered at Margaret's cabin. Not to condemn her, not to protest, to stand with her. Mary Henderson was there with her children. Pastor Williams, Dr. Patterson, Jenny Chen and her father Robert, Sarah Mitchell and the town council. Even Susan from the post office looking ashamed. And standing beside them, Tank Rider, Ghost Jack, and 20 former bikers ready to defend the community that had finally accepted them. "The Ironwood chapter declared war," Jack announced. "They're coming for all of us. We can't fight them alone." "Then we fight together," Mayor Thornton said firmly. Margaret stood on her porch looking at the impossible scene before her. A town that had been divided now united. Citizens and former criminals standing shoulder to shoulder. All because she'd refused to let two strangers die in the snow. "What do we do?" someone asked. Margaret looked at Jack. He looked at Tank. Tank looked at the townspeople who'd saved his daughter. Then they started planning. Because war was coming to Pine Hollow, and this time everyone would be ready. The war everyone expected never came. Instead, 3 days after the attempted kidnapping, the FBI arrived in Pine Hollow with a convoy of black SUVs and enough firepower to invade a small country. Special Agent Rebecca Torres knocked on Margaret's cabin door at 7 in the morning. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed, wearing a bulletproof vest under her FBI jacket. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to speak with you about the Hells Angels." Margaret invited her in and made coffee while Torres set up a recording device on the kitchen table. "The Ironwood chapter has been on our radar for years," Torres explained. "Drug trafficking, weapons violations, murder for hire. We've been trying to build a case, but witnesses keep disappearing or refusing to testify." She looked at Margaret directly. "The man who tried to kidnap Tank Mercer's daughter, he's talking. Gave us names, locations, everything. Says he wants a deal." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because he says the Ironwood President Cage is planning something big, a retaliation attack, here in Pine Hollow." Torres paused. "He says they're targeting you specifically, Mrs. Whitmore. You and everyone who's helped the former Montana chapter." Margaret's hands tightened on her coffee cup. "When? We don't know. Could be tomorrow, could be next month. But it's coming." Torres leaned forward. We can offer you protection. Witness protection program. New identity, new location. You'd be safe. Absolutely not. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not running from my home. I'm not abandoning the people who stood by me. Margaret's voice was steel. If Cage wants a fight, he'll get one. Torres studied her for a long moment. You know, in my 15 years with the Bureau, I've never seen anything like what's happened here. A civilian transforming violent criminals through simple human decency. It's either the bravest thing I've ever witnessed or the most reckless. Can it be both? Margaret asked, echoing the words she'd said to Ghost months ago. Torres almost smiled. Yeah, I guess it can. The FBI set up a command post in Pine Hollow's community center. They brought surveillance equipment, tactical teams, intelligence analysts. Sheriff Bradley worked with them to coordinate local law enforcement. But the real defense came from an unexpected source. That afternoon, Margaret's cabin became command central for something that had never existed before: an alliance between former criminals and the community they'd once terrorized. Jack spread maps across Margaret's kitchen table. Tank marked defensive positions. Ghost coordinated communication networks. And sitting beside them were Mayor Thornton, Pastor Williams, and Mary Henderson, contributing ideas and resources. We've got 3 main roads into town, Jack explained. Black Ridge Road here, Highway 12 from the east, and Old Mill Road from the south. If Ironwood comes, they'll use one of those routes. We set up checkpoints, Sheriff Bradley suggested. FBI at one, my deputies at another, your people at the third. Our people, Mary corrected quietly. They're part of this community now. The words hung in the air. Jack looked at Mary, this woman who'd feared him so much she'd refused to let him help her freezing children. Now she was calling him community. Thank you, he said simply. They planned through the night. Evacuation routes for families with children, safe houses, communication protocols, medical stations. It was like preparing for a siege, because that's exactly what it was. Ryder sat up in the corner with his sketch pad, drawing the layouts, the positions, the contingencies. His hands moved fast, translating complex tactical plans into clear visual guides. You're good at this, Agent Torres observed, watching over his shoulder. I was going to use these skills for crime, Ryder said without looking up. Figured I'd try using them for something better. How's college going? I got an A on my first assignment. Drew a portrait series of people who'd changed my life. Ryder glanced at Margaret. She was the first one. At midnight, they finally took a break. Most people went home to rest, but Tank stayed behind, sitting on Margaret's porch steps in the cold. Margaret brought him coffee and sat beside him. Sarah's mother took her out of state, Tank said quietly, to her sister's place in Wyoming. Said she won't bring her back until this is over. That's smart. She'll be safe there. I know, but I just got her back, you know, after 2 years of not seeing her, not being part of her life, and now she's gone again. Tank's voice broke. What if something happens? What if I die before I get to tell her I love her one more time? Then you call her right now and tell her. Tank pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed. It rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered. Rachel, it's Tank. I know it's late, but I need to talk to Sarah, please. There was a long pause, then hold on. A moment later, a sleepy child's voice came through the speaker. Daddy. Tank's face crumpled. Hey, baby girl, I'm sorry I woke you up. It's okay. Are you safe? Yeah, sweetheart, I'm safe. I just wanted to tell you something important. Tank wiped his eyes. I love you so much, more than anything in the whole world. And I'm going to keep being the daddy you deserve, I promise. I love you too, Daddy. Sarah yawned. Mr. Tommy visited me before we left. He gave me a drawing that Mr. Ryder made. It's you and me together smiling. That sounds beautiful. When can I come home? Soon, baby. Real soon. Now go back to sleep, okay? After he hung up, Tank sat in silence for a long time. Thank you, he finally said to Margaret, for everything. For saving my life, for giving me a second chance, for showing me I could be better. You showed yourself that, Tank. I just didn't let you die before you figured it out. Inside the cabin, Ryder was still drawing. But now he was sketching something different. A portrait of Margaret standing on her porch, surrounded by people from the town and former bikers standing together. At the bottom, he wrote, the woman who saved a town by refusing to let 2 strangers die. The next 3 days were tense. Everyone waited for the Ironwood chapter to make their move. The FBI intercepted communications suggesting an attack was imminent. Families kept children home from school. Businesses closed early. The town held its breath. Then on the fourth day, something unexpected happened. A single motorcycle pulled into Pine Hollow. Not Ironwood colors, different patches, different chapter. The rider parked in front of Margaret's cabin and removed his helmet. He was older, maybe 65, with white hair and a face lined with hard years. His jacket said, California Chapter, Original Member. Jack stepped forward, hand on his weapon. State your business. My name's Samuel Preacher Johnston, the old biker said calmly. I'm here to talk to Margaret Whitmore. About what? About stopping a war. Margaret came out onto her porch. I'm Margaret. Preacher looked at her for a long moment, then smiled sadly. Ma'am, I've been a Hell's Angel for 42 years. I've seen the club do terrible things. I've done terrible things. But I've also seen moments of honor, loyalty, and brotherhood that most people never experience. He gestured at Jack and the others. What you did for these men, saving them, believing in them, giving them a chance to be better, that's the truest form of brotherhood there is. Why are you here? Margaret asked. Because word spreads in the motorcycle world. Every chapter in America has heard what happened in Pine Hollow, how you transformed the Montana chapter, how they chose compassion over violence. Preacher's voice grew stronger. And it's causing a split. Half the clubs think it's weakness. The other half think it's evolution. Which half are you? The half that's tired of violence, ma'am. The half that's lost too many brothers to bullets and prison and hate. Preacher pulled an envelope from his jacket. I've been authorized by 6 chapters, California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Oregon, and Washington, to deliver this message to the Ironwood chapter. He handed the envelope to Jack. Inside was a single sheet of paper with signatures from leaders of 6 different Hells Angels chapters. The message was simple. The Montana chapter acted with honor. Any attack on Pine Hollow will be considered an attack on all of us. Stand down or face the consequences. Jack stared at the paper, his hands shaking. This is unprecedented. It's a revolution, Preacher said quietly, started by an old woman who refused to let 2 men freeze in the snow. He looked at Margaret. You've changed more than you know, ma'am. You've shown people like us that we can be something other than what the world expects. Agent Torres, who'd been listening from inside the cabin, stepped out. Mr. Johnston, I'm FBI. I need to know, is this legitimate? Will the Ironwood chapter actually back down? Cage is a lot of things, but he's not stupid. He won't fight a war against 6 chapters to prove a point. Preacher mounted his bike again. The threat's over, Agent Torres. The war's been called off. He started his engine, then paused and looked back at Margaret. My grandson is 12 years old. He's been getting in trouble at school fighting stealing. His parents don't know what to do with him. Preacher's eyes were wet. But I'm going to tell him about you, Mrs. Whitmore, about what you did here. And I'm going to tell him that strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how much you're willing to love people who don't deserve it. Then he rode away, his engine fading into the distance. Margaret sat down heavily on her porch steps. Around her, people were crying, hugging, celebrating. The threat was over. The war had been prevented, not through violence, but through the ripple effect of compassion. But Margaret wasn't celebrating. She was thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The fear, the division, the hatred, the slow, painful healing, the cost of choosing kindness in a world that often punished it. Mrs. Whitmore, it was Tommy Rodriguez, his face still bruised from saving Sarah. Are you okay? I'm tired, Tommy, so tired. You should rest, it's over now. Is it? Margaret looked at the town below, at Pine Hollow spread out in the valley. The Ironwood threat is over. But what about the next threat? What about all the other small towns where people are afraid of anyone different? What about all the other broken people who think they're beyond redemption? Tommy sat beside her. I think you've done enough, Mrs. Whitmore. You've changed this town. You've changed those men. You've even changed the Hells Angels. That's more than most people do in a lifetime. But it's not finished. Maybe it doesn't need to be finished. Maybe you just need to have faith that what you started will continue without you. Margaret looked at this young man who'd risked everything for a child he barely knew. When did you get so wise? Tommy laughed. My brother Carlos called me yesterday from rehab. He's 60 days sober now. He said something I'll never forget. What? He said, Tommy, the world is full of people waiting for someone to believe in them. Mrs. Whitmore believed in people she didn't even know. Imagine what we could do if we believed in people we do know. Tommy's voice was thick with emotion. So I'm going to start believing Mrs. Whitmore, in Carlos, in the former bikers in this town. And I'm going to teach others to believe too. 2 months later, Pine Hollow looked like a different place. The former Montana chapter members had formed a new organization called Second Chances MC, a motorcycle club dedicated to community service and helping former criminals reintegrate into society. They wore new patches, new colors, but the same brotherhood. Tank had full custody of Sarah on weekends and was working as a counselor for veterans with PTSD. Ryder was teaching free art classes at the community center every Tuesday night. Ghost had started a motorcycle repair shop that specifically hired people with criminal records. The town that had been divided was now hosting the first annual Pine Hollow Unity Festival, a celebration of the transformation that had occurred. Former opponents worked side by side on planning committees. The Methodist Church partnered with Second Chances MC to provide winter clothing for homeless veterans. Mary Henderson publicly apologized to Margaret during a town hall meeting, tears streaming down her face, and asked for forgiveness. Margaret gave it without hesitation. But the real change was quieter, deeper. It was in the way people stopped crossing the street to avoid the former bikers. In the way children waved at Tank when he rode through town with Sarah on the back of his motorcycle. In the way Pastor Williams asked Ryder to create artwork for the church. In the way the entire community had learned that fear could be overcome with understanding and hate could be transformed through love. Margaret was in her cabin on a cold December morning when she heard motorcycles approaching. She looked out the window and saw the entire Second Chances MC riding up Black Ridge Road, maybe 30 bikes in formation. They parked around her cabin and dismounted. Jack led the group to her porch. Mrs. Whitmore, we have something for you. They'd brought a wooden plaque, hand-carved and beautiful. Ryder had designed it, Tank had built it, Ghost had finished it. It read, "In honor of Margaret Whitmore, who taught us that saving a life isn't about who deserves it, it's about who we choose to be." January 15th, 2025, the day everything changed. Margaret touched the carving, her fingers tracing the letters. "It's beautiful. We're installing it at the entrance to Pine Hollow," Jack said. "So everyone who comes to this town knows what happened here, what you made possible." "I didn't do anything special. You did everything special," Tank corrected gently. "You saw us as human beings when the rest of the world saw criminals. You believed we could change when we didn't believe it ourselves. You stood up for us when it cost you everything." Sarah, Tank's daughter, stepped forward. She was holding a drawing, a child's crayon portrait of an old woman with silver blonde hair, standing in the snow, pulling a sled with 2 people on it. "I made this for you," Sarah said shyly. "My daddy says you're a hero." Margaret knelt down, ignoring the pain in her arthritic knees, and took the drawing. "Thank you, sweetheart. But I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who did what needed doing." "That's what heroes are," Sarah said simply. Later that evening, after everyone had left, Margaret sat in Daniel's rocking chair and looked at the drawing Sarah had given her. She thought about her husband, gone 6 years now, but still present in every corner of this cabin, every memory, every choice she'd made. "I kept my promise, Daniel," she whispered to the empty room. "I didn't let it make me hard. I didn't let it make me cruel." She thought about the morning she'd found Tank and Ryder freezing in the snow. How easy it would have been to walk past. How much simpler her life would have been if she'd just called 911 and continued her walk. But that wasn't who she was. That wasn't who Daniel had taught her to be. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is Catherine Morris from the Today Show. We'd love to interview you about what happened in Pine Hollow. The story of how you transformed a violent motorcycle gang through compassion has captured national attention." Margaret hung up. She didn't need national attention, didn't want it. The transformation that had occurred in Pine Hollow wasn't about her. It was about Tank finding his daughter, about Ryder discovering his art, about Ghost learning to trust, about an entire community realizing that fear didn't have to define them. It was about 30 broken men finding redemption because one old woman refused to let them die. That was enough. That was everything. A year later, Margaret was walking Black Ridge Road on a crisp January morning When she saw fresh flowers at the spot where she'd found Tank and Ryder, she walked over and found a small memorial stone placed there by someone who'd visited in the night. It read, "Where death was defeated by love, January 15th, 2025. Margaret touched the stone and smiled. She continued her walk 5 miles up the mountain road, 5 miles back down. Her daily routine, her anchor. And as she walked, she thought about all the lives that had changed because she'd made one simple choice: to see humanity and people the world had labeled as monsters, to offer compassion without conditions, to refuse to walk past someone in need regardless of who they were or what they'd done. Behind her, the sun rose over the Montana mountains, painting the snow gold. Ahead of her, Pine Hollow was waking up, a town transformed, a community healed, a miracle born from the simplest act of human kindness. And on her mountain in her cabin, Margaret Whitmore lived the rest of her days knowing she'd kept her promise to Daniel. She hadn't let the world make her hard. She'd stayed soft where it mattered most. And in doing so, she'd proven that love, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, even when it costs everything, love is always the stronger choice.